Now, South Africa's push for female empowerment has led to an outperformance against emerging market peers when measured by gender diversity in listed company boards. This despite a consensus that a realization that much more needs to be done to pursue equality. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the only exchange from a developing country to beat the Group of 20 average for female representation among directors of company traded on the bourse. According to figures from sustainable stock exchanges, women hold 29% of the board seats in the top 100 listed companies in South Africa. And that compares with an average of 20% on major G20 exchanges and figures of 12% in Japan, 10% for Shanghai's bourse and 7.4% in South Korea. South African women share 11% of companies, beating the G20 average of just 5.5%. Well, for more insight into this, we're now joined by Chief Sustainability Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, Shameela Soobramoney. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
These are pretty impressive statistics for South Africa and the listed companies. How long have we been working at this, and has this been a concerted effort to get to these figures?
So I think that when we look at the figures, we don't look at the exchange in isolation. We look at an entire ecosystem within the country that has been trying to push the agenda on gender equality for a number of years. So one would argue that it's many years in the making, and of course the tracking of it being a relatively more recent event. But, that takes concerted effort. It takes time to build a pipeline. It takes time to bring those changes into what was dominantly a patriarchal society. So this is thanks to the efforts of many different actors in that ecosystem over a period of time, and consistent effort, and of course for women themselves challenging and pushing the bar.
All right, so how significant is this number, this statistic?
So for us, I think it's the recognition. The JSE sees that the recognition by the Sustainable Stock Exchanges report really highlights the high quality of female leadership across the world. And it also illustrates that South Africa is home to a number of highly regarded female leaders who are actively supporting that gender equality agenda and representing our country at a very senior level. It's also important, I think, Peter, to acknowledge that while the report shows that we're taking a step in the right direction, most certainly, there's a significant amount of work that remains to be done in that quest for gender equality. And seeing numbers like this helps us to see where we can fill some of those gaps. But it also doesn't necessarily tell the full tale about how difficult it is sometimes to fill those gaps. And then, of course, the important role of leadership. And leadership teams really set an important benchmark for any organization and have that opportunity and a responsibility to drive transformation at all levels.
All right, so apart from trying to reach equity targets, what does it actually mean to have more women sitting on these boards? What does it mean for business generally and, dare I say, society?
So generally for business, I think, there have now been just numerous reports and overwhelming evidence that suggests that diversity in all its forms, including gender, is fundamentally good for business. It brings in different perspectives. It increases the value, the thought process around the table, which ultimately derives better value for businesses. And so if we look at it purely from that perspective, I think it's very critical to consider that this is an agenda that we need to pursue.
All right, so you talked about benchmarks a short while ago. I think you've set one for emerging markets. And we are at different levels of development, really. I mean, South Africa, to be fair, perhaps sometimes looks like a developed nation in some areas. And so maybe it was a lot easier for us to get to those targets. But across the continent, I guess this is something that's going to be quite a challenge.
It is certainly going to be a challenge, but I think, the reassuring thing is that if we look back at the evidence, at least that is one challenge that hopefully we don't really need to make the stronger case from, because we've seen that women with a seat at the table bring unique perspectives to the decision-making process. And yes, we need to be able to push that narrative across to start showing that this is just not about an agenda and pushing numbers. This is about saying this fundamental value that is brought by actually enabling women and allowing for their participation more fully in the economy. The perspectives that they bring are absolutely invaluable. And really, when you don't include women, you're effectively excluding half your population from driving an agenda. And we've also seen that that's fundamentally bad for GDP, even. So let's look at those numbers, let's look at what that means, and also that really pivotal role that women play in the economy.
All right, so perhaps you can walk the journey with us, because when we walk into a university class, it's quite equitable now. You know, the number of chartered accountants that are coming through, a lot of women are starting to show face in that arena. BCom marketing, BCom this. So where does it start to slow down for women to get to those board positions and the CEO position?
So, Peter, that is a very, very interesting question, and I think the right question. So, getting them there into the classroom, getting those equitable levels, as you suggested, in universities and things, is perhaps the easier part in some ways, and but also has been a struggle to get there. Once we get into the work environment, I think that the challenges that women face are often quite unique in many respects. We're still playing that juggling act, most notably between being a homemaker, being, the bearer of children, and the different setbacks in some ways that potentially makes us face in the working environment. If we look just in the year that we've had in review, for example, with the pandemic, we've seen now that women are many, many more more likely to actually leave the workforce as a consequence of some of the pressures that they face. Now, this points to some of the more fundamental structural issues that we're facing, and the fact that the burden of childcare, for example, tends to fall back on women. And I say burden in inverted commas because I would never consider a child to be a burden, but it is really that duty of care that tends to follow them. And so you're finding women pursuing a similar agenda. You're just as busy. Your working schedule is as fully loaded as any man's is, but you're also pursuing these other responsibilities. That is when it starts potentially affecting your career progression prospects. When you start often making more conscious decisions at the senior levels to perhaps not pursue those roles because of the additional time requirements and the responsibility and the difficult balancing act that you often have to face. And it's some of those sorts of pressures that we're starting to see. Adjacent to that is, of course, some of the other issues where the patriarchal system, the all boys club, is quite entrenched in as particularly the more senior roles. Breaking through those barriers often also poses its own set of challenges. And so putting in place the right kind of support mechanisms and the programs that explicitly recognize these unique challenges that women face is necessary. And so paying more attention to that will help us get through those numbers and push those numbers up in the more senior roles, certainly. But I do think it is that explicit recognition that some of those challenges are unique, need to be considered in that way, and the support mechanisms perhaps need to be altered to be able to take that into account.
All right, and you know, they always used to say that if you're a woman, you have to work twice as hard to prove your worth in a male environment. Is that still the case, or is it starting to shift a little bit? You know, it's not that long ago when a woman walks into a boardroom, people think maybe she's the secretary or a PA to somebody.
Those sort of anecdotal
Yeah.
examples, I think, in many instances still hold true. I think we see certain sectors, for example, that are potentially still more male dominated, but the changing attitudes, I think, at least are a reason to hope. And the numbers that we're seeing coming through hopefully also suggest that the value of that diversity is now being seen differently. And so we're breaking down some of those barriers and those notions. We do see definitely some of the barriers still exist. I think that pushing through them is not going to be easy. However, once we get more women, hopefully more women also help pull other women up. and recognize their challenges. That does not exclude men, because we're also seeing that there's a rising cohort of men who are explicitly acknowledging those challenges and the role that they play in helping to elevate that, in helping to give women that step in that direction that they need, and the push sometimes that assists in that way. Women themselves also bear responsibility in making some of those challenges clearer and in helping to break down those barriers and setting and charting a pathway that works for them.
Yeah, the business case, I think, as you said, the research is showing that there is definitely some proof that where women are involved in boards, they perform better. And maybe then that what leads to is this question. We talk a lot about we're the same, we're equal, all of that, and that's great. But we are different, and I wonder if women come with a different perspective that then adds the value.
I certainly do think that they do that. And I think not more about what I think, but the evidence and the research is certainly pointing in that direction. And again, I think, Peter, we bring it back to that conversation on diversity in all its forms. So the gender diversity brings a perspective, the racial diversity, the various forms that we look at, I think, about diversity and inclusion are really at the nub of that conversation. And so if I think about the JSE, for example, I mean, it's perhaps one of the more unusual places where you'd very rarely walk into any meeting and find that it's a male-dominated meeting. We're an organization that is 60% women at a board level and 66% at an exco level, and that is quite unusual, particularly in financial services. So, we're, I guess, in some instances, a case that it works and that it can continue to work because those numbers have held steady, and we're also onto our second female CEO in succession.
Shameela Soobramoney, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us and talking about a really good story. And let's hope that that number creeps up above 50% in the near future.
Absolutely, Peter. I hope that's sooner than later, and we'll be having this conversation soon and have those numbers to bear testament.
Great. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.